Welcome to Second Amendment Week. This is the one I know some of you have been eagerly waiting for, and this is probably one of the most controversial amendments that we'll go over all year. Even if you don't care too much about politics, it seems like everyone and their grandmother has an opinion about the Second Amendment. But what does the Second Amendment even mean? Can government take certain firearms away from you? Can government ban certain types of weapons? Do people have a right to own any type of weapon? What's that whole thing about a militia even mean? Is Joe Biden and the Democrats going to take your guns away? Are Republicans going to purchase a tank for every American citizen? When is Mr. Lucas just going to cue the intro and get on with the lesson? Honestly, this year I'm kind of happy to be doing this lesson online and not in the classroom. Because whenever I try to talk about the Second Amendment, I always have one side of the class that breaks out into,
"You'll never take my guns. You'll never take my guns. You want to talk about some mammals? You ain't seen nothing yet."
I hear you guys, but all I've literally said is let's talk about the Second Amendment today.
Before you ever take my guns, you'll never take my guns.
Okay, let's talk about some Supreme Court cases. And then I have another side of the classroom that says things like,
I say we will not stop until every man, every woman, every child, and every American can live without fear of gun violence, and to that I say, no more.
okay, cool guys, but why don't we dive into what the Founding Fathers meant by the word militia?
Thank you, I love you all, God bless all of you, and God bless America.
And then before you know it, my class has turned into the Ukrainian parliament. But online, you guys can say whatever you want, and I can't hear you. Well, at least not until this week's CTQ. So like last week with the First Amendment, the first thing we're going to do is actually dive into the text of the Second Amendment and read what it says. The Second Amendment states, a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, if I was an English teacher and the framers of the Constitution came to me and presented me with the text of the Second Amendment, I would definitely make them rewrite it because it sounds very choppy and it doesn't flow very well. And because of that, we've got to break it down piece by piece. That first phrase there, a well-regulated militia, requires us to know what a militia even is. And not just any militia, but what was a militia during the Founding Fathers era. There are some people in modern times today that argue the word militia means that you can't own a weapon unless you're part of like a state's National Guard. Is that right? So we're kind of putting on our judicial hat here. So during the Founding Fathers' time, a militia was a military force that was raised from the civilian population to add on to a regular army in an emergency. So let's say, for example, that the area was under threat from Native Americans attacking or an invading army, then the militia, which was made up of ordinary men, would be called up to defend the state using their own personal weapons. I know what some of you are thinking. Hold up, Mr. Lucas, before you go any further. How do we know that you're not a conservative or a liberal trying to promote your own view of the Second Amendment on us and make us believe that that's fact? Oh, if only I was so maniacal. But it's a legitimate point, so I'll stick to what the Founding Fathers said about what these different terms mean. I'll keep my personal opinion out of it. So speaking of the Founding Fathers, see what they said about the term militia and what it actually means. George Mason said, I ask, who are the militia? They consist now of the whole people except a few public officers. Richard Henry Lee said, a militia, when properly formed, are in fact the people themselves and render regular troops in a great measure unnecessary. Trench Cox said, as civil rulers, not having their duty to the people duly before them, may attempt to tyrannize, and as the military forces which must be occasionally raised to defend our country might pervert their power to the injury of their fellow citizen, the people are confirmed by the next article, meaning the Second Amendment, in their right to keep and bear their private arms. All right, modern terms, Mr. Lucas, what does that even mean? So a militia was basically Joe Schmo and Billy Bob down the street who had their own weapons at home that could be called up to help defend the state from like Native American attacks, or I don't know, maybe the Redcoats and the British trying to attack the state. Some people think that the militia back then was like the National Guard is today, but they're not the same thing. Militias in that form had existed for hundreds of years before that point and were really popular during the colonial times in America as villages and little little towns would oftentimes have to call up the militia, basically anyone in the town that owned a weapon, to defend from attacks from Native Americans, or during the French and Indian War from the French, or whoever it may be. Founding fathers didn't just trust the military to protect the people because, I don't know, was there anything in their experience that happened where the military of the country they were a part of ended up turning against the people? Gosh, I can't put my finger on an incident where that may have happened. I don't know, but to them it kind of seemed like a good idea for the people to be able to defend themselves and not be defenseless, especially against their own military, because history has shown sometimes the military doesn't just fight external threats. Sometimes the military can be used unjustly against the people. Okay, so a militia is your common everyday person that owns a weapon. But what about that word well-regulated? Does that mean the government can regulate the militia and determine what types of guns the common people have access to? No, let's ask Alexander Hamilton. In Federalist number 29, Alexander Hamilton described regulating as meaning organizing, disciplining, arming, and training. Okay, so well-regulated militia basically means that the militia is well-armed, they're disciplined, and they're trained. They know how to fight. This essentially means that when a state calls up their militia, it's necessary they meet the criteria of being well-disciplined, well-armed, and well-trained. Otherwise, they're going to get their rear end handed to them in battle. Then, perhaps one of the most important parts of the Second Amendment is the comma after a well-regulated militia. Because the next part says being necessary to the security of a free state. What does that mean? That means the people being armed is necessary for a state to be free from tyrannical rule from an absolute power. And here's a quote from one of the world's most tyrannical dictators, Adolf Hitler, who said the most foolish mistake we could possibly make would be to allow the subjugated races to possess arms. History shows that all conquerors who have allowed their subjugated races to carry arms have prepared their own downfall by doing so. Indeed, I would go so far as to say that the supply of arms to the underdogs is a sine qua non for the overthrow of any sovereignty. So let's not have any native militia or native police. Hitler's saying there he doesn't want anyone he rules over to have access to weapons, because if they do, they pose a threat to him and his power, because they could start a rebellion and overthrow the government. I mean, let's take Germany between World War I and World War II as a case study. As part of the Treaty of Versailles, there were regulations on weapons ownership where, quote, all firearms as well as all kinds of firearms ammunitions are to be surrendered immediately. In 1920, there was a law passed on the disarmament of the people, which was a limit on military-style weapons. In 1928, there was a law passed on firearms and ammunition where, quote, only those persons whose trustworthiness is not in question and who can show a need for a gun permit could have weapons. In 1938, the German Weapons Act was passed, and that loosened restrictions for those part of the Nazi Party, but restricted those who were not Aryan. And some of those things at first glance don't sound that bad. I mean, of course we don't really want weapons of war on the streets, and of course you would only want the government to allow people to have weapons that are trustworthy and good. But just like I mentioned last week with the laws against hate crimes against Jews in the 1920s, once the Nazis took power, they then began to use these laws against the people, to oppress the people. With a largely disarmed population, it wasn't hard then for the Nazis to round people up and start sending them to concentration camps. They faced little to no resistance, and that's exactly what the Founding Fathers were afraid might happen if the people were not allowed to keep and bear arms. After all, having access to their own weapons is exactly how the Founding Fathers were able to overthrow their own generation's tyrannical government in the British. They knew had they not had access to their own weapons that revolution would have never happened. I mean, it'd be hypocritical if you just won a revolution by fighting with your own weapons to overthrow a tyrannical government, and then when you create and establish your own government, you then don't allow the people to have their own weapons to potentially overthrow your government in case it gets tyrannical. That's why many of the Founding Fathers believed that the Second Amendment's preservation of the right to bear arms is more essential to preserving American freedom than even like the right to vote. So the Second Amendment wasn't established just so you could go hunting or defend yourself against a home invader. It was established also to preserve the right of the people to rebel against their government in case it became tyrannical. After all, Thomas Jefferson did write in the Declaration of Independence, which established the independence of the United States, that the people have a right to alter or abolish their government if it becomes destructive and abusive of the rights of the people. Speaking of rights, that's precisely why they included this next part of the Second Amendment. After that all-important comma, the next part of the Second Amendment says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That means that there's an individual right that all people possess to keep and bear arms, which is to be separated from the right of the militia, hence the comma. This right is not to be taken away by government. That word infringed means violated or encroached upon. This is why the comma is important. It helps us rearrange this jumbled mess of words and thought that is the Second Amendment. The commas in the Second Amendment help us string together the different concepts that are in the Second Amendment. So again, the actual text of the Second Amendment says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Which means if we were to unjumble that mess and put it in more modern terms, it would say something like, in order for the states/people to be free from government tyranny, they must have a well-armed and well-trained militia. Militias are composed of the whole people themselves, which means the people's right to keep and own weapons cannot be taken away. And that is the Second Amendment. Just kidding. It's actually about to get a little more complex. It's usually around this time that I get a student, a very brave student, that will ask me, but Mr. Lucas, does that mean like we can own tanks and bazookas and nuclear weapons? Are those things protected under the Second Amendment? I mean, back in the Founding Fathers' day, they just had muskets and cannons, which took forever to load. Surely they wouldn't have allowed for assault weapons and nuclear weapons to be owned by the people if they knew how destructive those things could be. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is where the real debate around the Second Amendment begins. Now, while there definitely are some people out there that are all for abolishing the Second Amendment and banning all guns, which ironically they would need guns to actually enforce that, most of the debate today is about where the line is drawn in terms of what guns are allowed and what guns are off limits. I mean, how do you read the Second Amendment? If the Second Amendment says the right to bear arms shall not be infringed, and that word arms includes things like nuclear weapons, such a rigid, absolute, literal interpretation of arms in the Second Amendment might mean your neighbor down the street can acquire a nuclear weapon. Most people are fine with rifles and handguns, but I think most people probably wouldn't support nuclear weapons being legalized throughout the nation. Again, the question is, where do you draw the line? Should people be allowed to own bazookas? Should people be allowed to own their own tanks? That would be interesting. And probably the one that receives the most attention today, assault weapons.
What kind of guns would you like to see banned?
Just assault rifle.
What are assault weapons, you might ask? Turns out not a whole lot of people know.
Do you know what an assault weapon is?
Yeah, it's assault weapon. It's like a, I kind of do, but kind of don't.
Okay.
Like,
It's just, well,
What is an assault weapon?
Can any of you tell me what an assault weapon is?
All right, just so you don't end up on one of these videos someday, whether you're for assault weapons or for banning assault weapons, let me give you the official government definition of assault weapon. The term assault weapon generally refers primarily to semi-automatic rifles, pistols, and shotguns that are able to accept detachable magazines and possess maybe some other features too. It include a pistol grip, a bayonet lug, a threaded barrel, a grenade launcher, a barrel shroud, a suppressor. You get the idea. Now, the reason some people want to ban assault weapons is because many of them are semi-automatic, which means that the gun kind of loads itself. You don't have to add more bullets into it. All you have to do is pull the trigger to release them. And a lot of mass shooters, unfortunately, utilize those types of weapons to inflict the maximum amount of damage possible in their shooting spurts. So the argument often is that guns that fire very quickly like that are weapons of war. It should only be used by the military and should not be accessible to civilians. So those that support banning assault weapons often want government to intervene and ban those types of weapons. They also support policies like background checks, where everyone that wants to purchase one of those weapons would be required to undergo a background check to make sure they don't have a criminal record or anything that might be suspicious about them purchasing a weapon. And it's just to make sure they're not on any FBI watch lists or anything for maybe potentially committing an act of terrorism. They might also support policies like requiring people to get a license and training before they're allowed to even purchase one of those weapons. They might often support policies that prevent people with mental health issues from obtaining such weapons. These are the types of policies that a lot of Democrats tend to support. Democrats often point to the gun control policies of other countries such as Australia, which show that there is a decrease in gun violence when weapons of war are taken off the street. Now, Republicans and libertarians tend to oppose these policies for a few reasons. First of all, they believe the intent of the Second Amendment was so that the people would have access to the same weapons as the military, so that it would be an even fight if they wanted to try to overthrow the government. Otherwise, if the military has access to super higher grade weapons, then the people stand no chance. If you're trying to defend yourself from government tyranny or even overthrow the government, it's not really going to go well for you if you only have access to a pistol or a shotgun and they have machine guns and tanks. Republicans and libertarians are also a little weary of the whole background check and licensing thing. I mean, like we saw with the Nazis and gun laws, what's to stop the government from changing the definitions in the law to maybe say that if I oppose the government, I have some sort of a mental illness, or if I oppose the government, maybe they make up some silly crime so that I fail the background check and get put onto a watch list and I'm unable to obtain weapons to defend myself. Republicans and libertarians argue these are the types of policies that led to certain groups of people in Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia losing their right to own weapons to defend themselves, and then it allowed the government to round them up and exterminate them. And lastly, libertarians and Republicans often argue that anyone that has malicious intent and is going to maybe kill someone, they're already breaking a law against murder. So if a law against murder is not going to stop them from murdering, why would a law against them owning a particular type of gun stop them from trying to get their hands on that particular gun? They therefore argue that the effect of the law is to disarm law-abiding citizens at the mercy of criminals ignoring the law and getting their hands on the guns anyway. So those are just some of the different arguments when it comes to a ban on assault weapons and gun control in general. And I am generalizing when I say Democrats generally support this and Republicans generally support that. There are some Republicans, for example, that do support background checks. And there are some Democrats that are a little more lenient when it comes to guns than some other Democrats. Now, the federal government has indeed banned certain types of weapons. For example, you can't own a nuclear weapon, and it's against the law to own a tank. In 1994, Congress passed an assault weapons ban, and it was signed by President Bill Clinton, and it lasted for 10 years and expired in 2004, but was not renewed. None of these laws have been challenged and made their way up to the Supreme Court yet, but there have been some gun bans that have made their way to the Supreme Court. There are two main Supreme Court cases when it comes to Second Amendment that are important to know. The first case is called D.C. versus Heller. This was a situation where Washington, D.C. banned all handguns, and of course, someone sued them and said that that violated the Second Amendment. In that case, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that the ban on handguns by D.C. was unconstitutional and that it did violate the Second Amendment. For the first time ever, the Supreme Court also addressed the question of whether or not gun ownership had to be tied to being part of a state militia, or if everyone could just individually own weapons on their own. The Supreme Court ruled that you don't have to be part of the militia to own weapons. Now, while the Supreme Court ruled that you do have an individual right to protect yourself with a weapon, they also ruled that the Second Amendment was not unlimited, meaning the government can still regulate firearms and maybe even ban certain types, but they can't ban all of them. I mean, if you ban all guns, then you're definitely violating someone's right to keep and bear arms, but if you just ban assault weapons, someone could still buy a pistol and defend themselves. 2 years later, in a similar case called McDonald versus Chicago, which challenged Chicago's ban on handguns, the Supreme Court made the same ruling, but now applied it to the state governments as well. As you can see, there's still a battle today over what the Second Amendment should include and what it should not include. Both of those Supreme Court cases I mentioned, they were decided by one vote, so not even the Supreme Court totally agrees on what the Second Amendment exactly means. I really wish the Founding Fathers had written it far more clearly. See, English class matters. So your assignments for this week. Obviously, you have this Ed puzzle and one other Ed puzzle that touches on the Second Amendment. Both of those are due on Wednesday. Then CTQs are back. This one is on an assault weapons ban. Hopefully during this video, you saw some of the different arguments that exist when it comes to gun ownership and assault weapons bans. Do you think government should be proactive to try to prevent mass shootings from occurring by banning certain types of weapons? Or do you look at history and just not really trust the government and err on the side of freedom and allowing people to have the same level playing field with the government when it comes to weaponry? Regardless of where you fall on this issue, make sure to take the time to take a look at that first slide and expose yourself to the different arguments. Then be ready to defend your position. And please remember, if you need help with anything, whether it be a question on an ed puzzle or if you just need help trying to figure out what you're going to say on this CTQ, feel free to email me and I'd be more than happy to help you out. As always, let me know if you need anything and have a great week.